Close your eyes for a moment and picture a pirate. Go on. Do it. There's a good chance you're seeing the same thing right now that nearly everyone on Earth would see. A weathered coat, salt-crusted and dramatic. A hat cocked at an angle that defies practical explanation. Maybe a parrot. Definitely a sword. A ship with black sails cutting through fog on a dark and stormy sea. Cannons bristling from the gun ports. A skull and crossbones flag snapping in the wind above it all like a declaration of war against the entire concept of civilization. And somewhere at the center of it, a man. Magnetic, dangerous, probably unwashed in a way that somehow still manages to look rakish rather than genuinely unpleasant. A man with a smirk that suggests he knows something you don't. A moral compass that spins freely in any direction he finds convenient. And an accent that no actual historical port city ever produced in the history of maritime travel. You know exactly who you're picturing. We all do. Because Hollywood gave him to us, and Hollywood, it must be said, did an extraordinary job. There is something genuinely magnificent about what cinema has done with pirates over the last century. From the swashbuckling silent film heroes of the 1920s to the elaborate, effects-laden blockbusters of our own era, the movies have handed us an image of the golden age of piracy, so vivid, so fully realized, so internally consistent in its own gorgeous mythology, that it has become more real to most people than the reality it was loosely, very loosely, constructed from. Hollywood took a chaotic, complicated, genuinely fascinating period of maritime history and transformed it into something almost operatic, grand, cinematic in the truest sense of the word. A canvas of tall ships and buried treasure and daring escapes, and men who chose freedom over civilization and paid for that choice with everything they had. For that, genuinely, the storytellers deserve credit. Real credit. Because the pirates of cinema have fired the imagination of generation after generation in a way that few historical figures manage. They made the 17th and 18th century seas feel alive and electric and dangerous and full of possibility. They made us root for outlaws, question authority through the safe distance of historical adventure, and spend a not insignificant portion of our childhoods absolutely convinced that there was buried treasure somewhere in the world with our name on it. But here's the thing about mythology, and pirates, at this point, are mythology as much as history. Mythology simplifies. Mythology smooths the rough edges, fills in the gaps with something more satisfying than the truth, and over time begins to quietly replace the actual record with a version that plays better in the dark of a movie theater. And the actual record of the golden age of piracy, the real men and women who sailed under the black flag between roughly 1650 and 730, who terrorized trade routes from the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, who built their own strange floating societies at the edges of the civilized world. That record is something Hollywood has never quite gotten around to telling accurately, which is a shame. Because the truth, as it so often is stranger and more interesting, and in several key respects, more human than the legend. The real pirates were not what you've been shown. Some of what you know is close. Much of it is wrong. And some of the things Hollywood invented wholesale to make the stories work are so thoroughly embedded in how we picture this world that it takes a genuine effort to dislodge them. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to take 7 of the most persistent, most beloved, most completely ingrained pieces of pirate mythology. Things you have seen in films, read in books, accepted as settled historical fact. And we're going to set the record straight. Not to diminish the stories. Never that. The stories are too good to diminish, and we'll be celebrating them all the way to the end. But the truth deserves its moment too. Because the men and women who actually sailed these seas were extraordinary enough to deserve to be understood as they actually were, not as Hollywood imagined them. The black flag is being raised. Let's begin. FA Seat 1 Pirates were among the most democratic societies on Earth. Hollywood has a type when it comes to pirate captains. You know the type immediately. He strides across the deck like he owns it, which, in the movies, he essentially does. He makes the decisions. He sets the course. He determines who gets rewarded and who gets punished, who eats and who goes hungry, who lives and who gets thrown overboard when the mood turns dark and the rum runs low. His word is law on that ship, absolute and final, and backed by the kind of casual violence that reminds everyone within earshot exactly what the chain of command looks like, and exactly where they sit on it. He is, in short, a tyrant, a glamorous one certainly, a charismatic one often, one we're meant to love and fear in roughly equal measure, whose authority is so total and so unquestioned that the only real dramatic tension available is whether the other characters can survive his whims long enough for the plot to resolve itself. It is a compelling image. It has anchored films and novels and television series for over a century. It is also, from a historical standpoint, almost perfectly wrong, because the real Golden Age pirates, the men who actually sailed under the black flag between the 1650s and the 1730s, who made the Caribbean and the Indian Ocean and the trade routes of the Atlantic genuinely dangerous for the merchant vessels of every empire on Earth, were not running tyrannies on their ships. They were running something that looked, in several key respects, astonishingly like a democracy, and not a loose, informal, gentleman's agreement kind of democracy. A written, constitutionally governed, contractually binding democracy, one with documented rules, protected rights, elected leadership, and a system of checks on power that was, in many ways, more sophisticated and more genuinely egalitarian than anything the legitimate nations of that era were offering their own citizens. Let that sit for a moment. At a time when the British Royal Navy was press-ganging men off the streets of port cities, literally kidnapping civilians and forcing them into naval service at sword point, and when merchant vessels operated under captains with near absolute authority over crews who had little legal recourse against any abuse their employers chose to inflict, the pirates operating just beyond the horizon of legal civilization had sat down together and written themselves constitutions. They called them articles, or ship's articles, or articles of agreement. The specific name varied by crew and by era. What didn't vary was the essential nature of what they were: a binding social contract, agreed to and signed, or marked, for those who couldn't write, by every member of the crew before the voyage began. A document that laid out, in specific and enforceable terms, exactly how the ship would be run, how decisions would be made, how the rewards of the enterprise would be divided, and what protections every man aboard was entitled to regardless of his rank. These weren't vague promises, they were operational law. The articles of Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age, by any measurable standard, a Welshman who captured somewhere between 400 and 500 vessels in a career of just under 3 years, and who remains, by sheer volume of prizes taken, the most prolific pirate in recorded history, survive in detailed form, and they read with a specificity that would not embarrass a modern labor lawyer. Every man aboard a Roberts vessel had an equal vote in ship's affairs, not a weighted vote, not a vote moderated by rank or experience, or the captain's personal feelings about the matter at hand. An equal vote. The course of the ship, the decision of whether to attack a particular vessel, the settlement of disputes between crew members, all of it subject to the collective will of the people aboard, expressed through a vote in which every voice carried the same weight. The plunder was divided by shares, and those shares were written down in advance so that nobody could be cheated after the fact. The captain received a larger share than common crew, typically 2 shares to the common sailors' 1, and certain officers received proportional increases for their specialized roles. But compare that to the distribution of prize money on a legitimate naval vessel of the same era, where a captain might receive several hundred times what a common sailor received from the same capture. And the pirate model begins to look less like greed and more like something that a later century would call workers' rights. There was compensation written into the articles for injuries sustained in service, not vague promises of gratitude, specific, documented, pre-agreed figures. Lose your right arm in a fight. And fighting was the job. So this was a genuine occupational hazard. And you were entitled to a specific number of pieces of 8, drawn from the common fund before any other division of plunder took place. Lose your left arm, and the figure was slightly different. Lose an eye, a leg, a finger. Each scenario had a corresponding payment, agreed to before anyone had lost anything, because the men who wrote these articles understood that the time to agree on compensation is before the injury, not after, when the man who owes it has already gotten what he needed from you. This was not charity. This was contract. And the captain himself, the figure that Hollywood has cast as an absolute monarch of the waves, was, in the actual historical record, nothing of the sort. Pirate captains were elected. They were elected by the crew from the crew, and they could be unelected with comparable efficiency if the crew decided their leadership was insufficient or their judgment was wrong, or their behavior had crossed whatever line the articles had established. There are documented cases of pirate captains being voted out mid-voyage. Crews who decided, in the middle of an operation, that the man they had chosen was not working out, and who exercised their contractual right to replace him with someone they trusted more. The captain's authority during a battle or an emergency was significant. The articles typically granted expanded individual authority in moments of immediate action, because committees cannot navigate cannon fire. But outside of those specific contexts, the captain was first among equals rather than lord of all he surveyed. There was typically a second officer, the quartermaster, whose specific constitutional role was to represent the crew's interests against the captain's authority. Not an executive officer in the military sense, subordinate to the captain in all things. A counterbalance, an institutionalized check on power, written into the governance structure of the vessel, because the people who wrote these articles had come, most of them, from legitimate vessels where no such check existed, and they had felt the absence of it in their own bodies, and they were not going to recreate that experience voluntarily. Most of the men who turned to piracy in the Golden Age were not born criminals, not lifelong outlaws, not men of irretrievably violent natures who had finally found an appropriate professional home. They were sailors, former Navy men, former merchant sailors, men who had spent years in the legitimate maritime economy and who had been treated, in that economy, as something very close to property. They knew what it felt like to have no rights and no recourse. They knew what it felt like to be commanded by a man whose authority was total and whose accountability was non-existent. They knew what it felt like to risk their lives and their health and their futures for a wage that could be withheld on a whim and a share of prize money that bore no relationship to the actual risk they had taken to earn it. And they had decided, collectively and in writing, that they were finished with all of that. The black flag was not simply a symbol of lawlessness. It was, in a strange and complicated and historically underappreciated way, a symbol of liberation. Men flew it because beneath it they had something the legitimate world had never offered them. A genuine stake in their own enterprise, a genuine voice in their own governance, a genuine set of rights that could not be arbitrarily revoked by someone who outranked them. This is the fact that Hollywood has never quite known what to do with, because a pirate ship run by democratic vote and written constitution does not produce the same dramatic architecture as a pirate ship run by the iron will of a magnetic and dangerous captain. The story of men who left the brutality of legitimate naval service to build something genuinely more equitable on the margins of the law, That story is compelling, but it is a different story, a more complicated one that asks you to hold two things at once, that these men were outlaws, and that their outlawry was, in certain respects, a response to conditions that were themselves deeply unjust. The Golden Age pirates were not angels. They were violent men operating in a violent world, and the freedom they built for themselves came at a very real cost to the people whose ships they took and whose lives they disrupted. That accounting is real and it cannot be wished away, but they were also something that no Hollywood film has ever quite had the nerve to show you directly. They were, in the specific and documented terms of how they organized themselves and governed themselves and treated each other, among the most radically democratic societies operating anywhere on Earth in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, decades before the American Revolution articulated the idea that all men are created equal. A group of outlaws on the open ocean had put it in writing, signed their names to it, and actually tried to live by it. The captain in the movies tells the crew what to do. The captain in the historical record asked them to vote. F.A. Sect 2. Pirate crews look nothing like what Hollywood shows you picture the crew. Not the captain this time. We've spent enough time with the captain. Picture the men behind him, the ones coiling rope on the deck, climbing the rigging, hauling on the lines, loading the cannons, sleeping in hammocks below decks in the close, salt, damp dark of a ship that is always moving, always groaning, always asking something physical of the bodies inside it. Picture the ordinary crew of a Golden Age pirate vessel, the rank and file, the people who actually made the Enterprise function from moment to moment. If your mental image comes primarily from cinema, and for most of us, it does, because cinema got there first and planted its flag before history had a chance to say anything, then you are almost certainly picturing a group of men who are, with perhaps one or two exotic exceptions, carefully positioned for visual interest, overwhelmingly white, British mostly, maybe a scattering of other European nationalities to add flavor, weathered, tattooed, scarred, dramatically lit, a community of outcasts from the fringes of European civilization, gathered together on the margins of the law. It is, like so much of Hollywood's pirate mythology, a coherent and visually consistent image. It is also, as a representation of what those crews actually looked like, a profound and consequential distortion, because the real crews of the Golden Age of piracy, the actual men sailing under the black flag in the Caribbean, on the Atlantic trade routes, across the Indian Ocean, along the coast of West Africa, were among the most racially and ethnically diverse communities operating anywhere on Earth in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, not accidentally, not incidentally, by design and often by explicit policy written into the same articles of agreement we discussed a moment ago. At the height of the Golden Age, historians estimate that somewhere between a quarter and a third of all Caribbean pirate crew members were of African descent. Some scholars put that figure higher for certain vessels, certain crews, certain specific periods of the Enterprise. The number is not precise. These were not people who submitted to census takers, but the evidence drawn from court records, captured crew lists, the accounts of survivors, and in some remarkable cases from the physical artifacts recovered from sunken pirate vessels, points consistently in one direction. These ships were black and white and everything in between, sailing together, governed by the same articles, entitled to the same shares, protected by the same written rights. Consider what that meant in context. The early 18th century was not a period of casual racial equality anywhere in the Atlantic world. The plantation economies of the Caribbean and the American colonies were operating at full, brutal capacity, consuming African lives with an efficiency that the word horrific does not adequately describe. The slave trade was moving hundreds of thousands of human beings across the ocean against their will every decade, reducing people to cargo, to property, to units of agricultural production. The legal, social, and economic structures of the entire Atlantic economy were organized, at their foundations, around a racial hierarchy so total that challenging it was not merely illegal but almost literally unthinkable within the mainstream institutions of the time. The pirates thought it anyway. Many of the black men sailing on pirate vessels in the Golden Age had come from the slave ships directly. When a pirate crew took a slave vessel, and they did take them with some regularity, because slave ships carried valuable cargo and were not typically equipped to offer serious resistance, they frequently did something that no other maritime institution of the era did as a matter of course. They opened the holds. They offered the men and women chained below decks a choice. Join the crew, sail under the articles, take your share of whatever the future brought, and be subject to the same rules and the same risks and the same rewards as every other person aboard. Or don't. Many chose to join. Given the alternative, this is perhaps not surprising. But what is remarkable, what history has not sufficiently emphasized, and Hollywood has almost entirely ignored, is that when they joined, the articles meant what they said. The same vote, the same share, the same injury compensation, the same voice in the governance of the vessel. Not as a subordinate category of crew member with separate and diminished terms. As crew, the ship's articles, at their best and most consistent, did not distinguish by race. They distinguished by role: captain, quartermaster, sailor, carpenter, surgeon, and they assigned shares and rights accordingly. But a black sailor and the common crew of a pirate vessel operating under rigorous articles was entitled, on paper and often in practice, to the same share of plunder as a white sailor in the same position. Nowhere else in the Atlantic world of 1700 was that true. The evidence is in the historical record in ways that are concrete and specific, not merely theoretical. When the pirate ship Wider Galley sank in a storm off Cape Cod in April of 1717, taking with it the crew of Samuel Bellamy, one of the most idealistic and philosophically articulate pirates of the entire Golden Age, it carried the remains of a crew that archaeological excavation, beginning in the 1980s, has revealed to have been strikingly diverse. The bones, the artifacts, the personal effects recovered from the wreck tell the story of a community drawn from multiple continents and multiple cultures, living and dying together in a vessel that had itself begun its life as a slave ship before Bellamy took it and, with a certain historical poetry, redirected its purpose entirely. Bellamy himself was known for speeches, and the accounts of survivors and captives who met him suggest he actually gave them, which was unusual enough to be recorded, in which he articulated something very close to a philosophy of radical equality. He spoke of the way legitimate society organized itself around protecting the property of the wealthy at the expense of everyone else. He spoke of the freedom available to men who stepped outside that arrangement. He was not merely a pirate by circumstance. He was, by the evidence of his own words, something approaching a pirate by conviction. He was 28 years old when the Wider went down. Then there is the figure known as Black Caesar, a man whose biography sits at the uncertain border between documented history and legend, which is where the most interesting people in the historical record always seem to live. The accounts of him describe a man of imposing physical presence, who had been an African chieftain before being captured into slavery, who escaped, who became a pirate of genuine capability and reputation in the waters around Florida and the Caribbean, who eventually sailed for a time with Blackbeard himself. When Blackbeard's fleet was captured and Blackbeard killed, Black Caesar was taken, tried, and executed in Williamsburg in 1718. He was not an anomaly. He was a data point in a pattern. Diego el Mulatto, Diego Grillo, a Cuban-born man of African and European descent, who became one of the most feared pirates operating in the Caribbean in the mid-17th century, raiding Spanish shipping with a ferocity that made him a diplomatic problem for multiple governments simultaneously. Captains and crews whose names and origins have been partially or entirely lost to the historical record, absorbed back into the general category of pirate. Their specific identities dissolved by archives that were rarely interested in preserving the details of men who existed outside the systems those archives were designed to document. The Indian Ocean pirates present a different version of the same essential story. The crews operating out of Madagascar in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, men like Henry Every, and the communities that formed around the pirate havens of that island, incorporated Malagasy crew members, sailors of Arab and South Asian origin, men drawn from the coastal communities of East Africa, alongside the European sailors who had arrived from the Atlantic world. These were not crews organized around any single cultural identity. They were, in the most literal sense of an overused modern phrase, genuinely multicultural communities, held together not by shared background, but by shared articles, shared risk, and shared reward. The multicultural reality of pirate crews was not, it should be emphasized, a perfect or uncomplicated equality. Human beings carry their prejudices with them, even into radical situations. And the historical record contains evidence of tension, of hierarchy persisting in practice even when the articles argued against it, of the gap between the ideals written into the social contract and the messy, imperfect way those ideals were actually lived. The pirates were not saints. They were not operating a utopia. They were outlaws building a community under extreme pressure, and extreme pressure does not reliably produce the best version of human behavior. But the baseline, the written, contractual, agreed-upon baseline, was more egalitarian in its racial terms than anything the legitimate world of the same era was offering. And for men who had experienced the legitimate world's racial hierarchy from the bottom of it, that baseline, imperfect as its application sometimes was, represented something genuinely worth crossing an ocean for. Hollywood has gotten better at this, slowly, in recent years. More diverse casting has begun to appear in pirate narratives, more acknowledgement that these crews were not monocultures, but the deeper truth. Not just that black and brown sailors were present on these ships, but that the structure of pirate society was, by the explicit design of its own governing documents, built to include them on genuinely equal contractual terms. That truth has not yet found its way into the popular imagination with anything like the force it deserves. The Hollywood pirate crew is a band of European outcasts. The historical pirate crew was something stranger and more radical than that. A floating experiment in equality, however flawed in execution, that was conducting itself in the open ocean while the world on shore was still centuries away from catching up to its written terms. The ships look different than the movies show you. The story is bigger because of it. FACT-3, the Jolly Roger, was designed to prevent violence, not cause it. There is no image more immediately, more completely, more universally associated with piracy than the flag. You don't need it described. It is already there in your mind, fully formed, the way certain symbols embed themselves so deeply into cultural memory that they require no retrieval. They are simply present, waiting. The black field, the white skull, the two bones crossed beneath it, an image so potent that it has outlasted the civilization that produced it by 3 centuries, migrated from the mastheads of actual pirate ships into Halloween costumes and children's birthday cakes and the logos of sports teams and the iconography of rock music and the corner of 1,000 different products that want to communicate danger, rebellion, and a certain romantic disregard for convention. Hollywood did not invent the Jolly Roger. The historical pirates flew it first, and flew it deliberately, and it worked on the people who saw it with exactly the kind of visceral, immediate, gut-level force that a well-designed symbol is supposed to work. But here is where Hollywood, and frankly, Everyone who has absorbed the popular mythology of piracy without looking too closely at the operational logic underneath it has gotten the meaning of that flag almost entirely backwards. The skull and crossbones, in the actual practice of the Golden Age pirates who flew it, was not primarily a symbol of violence. It was a promise of mercy. Let that reorient itself in your mind for a moment, because it requires a genuine shift of frame to fully absorb. The most feared symbol in the history of maritime terror, the image that made merchant sailors go pale and captains reach for their telescopes with hands that were no longer entirely steady. That symbol, in the coded communication system that the pirates of the Golden Age developed and operated with remarkable consistency, meant, surrender now, and you will live. To understand why, you need to understand what the alternative looked like. And the alternative was not the black flag. The alternative was a red one. The pirates of the Golden Age operated with two primary flags, and the distinction between them was not decorative. It was a matter of life and death communicated across open water before anyone could hear a spoken word. The black flag, whatever its specific design, whether it bore a skull, a skeleton, a dancing figure, an hourglass, or some combination thereof, meant that the pirates were willing to grant quarter. This was the maritime term for mercy, for the acceptance of surrender, for the agreement that captured sailors would be taken alive and treated as prisoners rather than killed on the spot. See the black flag, surrender your vessel without a fight. And the articles under which most pirate crews operated gave you a reasonable expectation of surviving the encounter. The red flag meant something else entirely. No quarter, no prisoners, no negotiations, no terms, no survival for anyone foolish enough to resist when that particular color was flying from that particular masthead. The red flag said that the crew approaching you had decided, for reasons that may or may not have included the level of resistance they'd already met that day, that they were not in the business of taking prisoners this time. Fight, and everyone dies. The red flag, in the operational vocabulary of the Golden Age pirates, was the terrifying one. The skull and crossbones was, comparatively, the olive branch. This inversion, this complete reversal of what the popular imagination has assigned to these symbols, is not a minor footnote. It speaks to something fundamental about how piracy actually worked as a business, as an enterprise, as a practical daily operation that had to function economically if it was going to function at all. Because the pirates were not, at their core, in the business of killing people. They were in the business of taking ships and cargo, and the valuables of the people aboard those ships. Violence was a tool in service of that business, not the point of the business itself. And violence, from a strictly operational standpoint, was expensive. A fight costs you crew members, men trained and experienced and difficult to replace in the middle of an ocean. A fight damages the prize vessel, which you may want to use, sell, or strip for parts. A fight destroys cargo that you came to take. A fight takes time that leaves you exposed in waters where exposure is dangerous. A fight, in short, is bad for the bottom line in almost every respect. The ideal pirate encounter, from the perspective of the pirates conducting it, was one in which no shot was fired, no blade was drawn, and the crew of the merchant vessel looked at the ship bearing down on them, thought carefully about their options, and handed over their cargo with the resigned practicality of men who had decided to be alive and poor rather than dead and heroic. The flag system was engineered to produce exactly that outcome. The appearance of the Jolly Roger on the horizon was the opening move in a negotiation, not a declaration of war. It communicated a package of information with extraordinary efficiency. We are pirates. We are committed to this. We have assessed your vessel and decided it is worth our attention, and we are offering you the following terms. Surrender, and the black flag is our guarantee that you will live. The skull grinning from that black field was not grinning at your death. It was grinning at your survival, if you were wise enough to accept the terms being offered. The specific designs of these flags across the Golden Age were as varied and as individually distinctive as the captains who flew them, and this variety was itself part of the system's sophistication. A pirate captain's flag was, in the most modern sense of the term, a brand. It was a reputation made visible, a way of announcing not just that you were a pirate, but which pirate you were, and the which, in many cases, carried enormous practical weight. Bartholomew Roberts flew a flag depicting himself, in full figure, standing with one foot planted on a skull labeled ABH, a Barbadian's head, and the other on one labeled AMH, a Martinican's head, a reference to the governments of those islands who had made particularly determined efforts to hunt him down. The flag was a statement and a taunt and a piece of psychological theatre simultaneously, communicating to any ship that encountered it exactly whose reputation was bearing down on them. By the time Roberts was at the height of his career, that reputation was extensive enough that the flag's appearance alone was frequently sufficient to end resistance before it began. Edward Lowe flew variations on the red skeleton. Not the red flag of no quarter exactly, but an image that borrowed the red's implications of unconditional threat, wrapped in a skeletal figure that communicated something about Lowe's particular approach to the enterprise, which was documented by survivors as being considerably more violent than most of his contemporaries. The flag was honest in its way. It told you something true about what you were dealing with. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, the man who has become perhaps the defining face of piracy in the popular imagination, flew a flag depicting a horned skeleton holding an hourglass in one hand and a spear pointed at a bleeding heart in the other. Every element of that image was a calculated communication. The hourglass said, "Your time is running out." The spear and the heart said, "Resistance will end badly for you specifically." The skeleton said, "This is what waits for you if you make the wrong choice." It was not decoration. It was a carefully composed message delivered at masthead height to every vessel that had the misfortune of appearing on Blackbeard's horizon. And then there was the tactical deployment of the flag, which was itself a piece of theatre as carefully choreographed as anything on a stage. Pirates approaching a target did not typically fly their true colors immediately. They flew false flags, the flags of legitimate nations, of merchant companies, of whatever identity was most likely to allow them to close the distance without raising alarm. A French merchant vessel, an English naval courier, whatever the situation called for, the disguise brought them proximity, and proximity was what they needed. The moment of revelation, the moment when the false flag came down and the black flag went up, was engineered for maximum psychological impact. By the time you saw the Jolly Roger, the ship flying, it was already close. Already committed, already angled toward you at a speed that made the distance between you something that could be measured in minutes rather than hours. The flag went up at precisely the moment when your window for escape had closed, or was closing, when the mathematical reality of your situation had shifted from theoretical danger to immediate and inescapable fact. That moment was designed to break your will, to resist before the first shot was fired. It worked with extraordinary regularity. Hollywood has taken this sophisticated, layered, operationally precise communication system and simplified it into pure visual menace. The black flag in the movies means danger, violence, doom. A skull grinning its promise of your death. The red flag barely appears at all, because the movies have no use for a distinction that requires the audience to hold two pieces of information simultaneously about what different colors mean. But the real system was more interesting than that. The real system was a negotiating table hoisted 60 feet in the air, flapping in the trade winds, readable at half a mile. It said, "We know what we're doing. We have thought about this. We have a preference for how this goes, and our preference is that it goes quickly and cleanly and without the kind of mess that makes everyone's morning significantly worse. Surrender, and the black flag is your guarantee. Fight, and we'll show you the red one." The skull was never the terrifying option. The skull was the way out. FACT4 Blackbeard was a psychological genius who almost never actually hurt anyone. Say his name. Go ahead. You know it. Everyone knows it. It is one of those names that has achieved a kind of cultural permanence so complete that it no longer requires context or explanation or historical framing. It arrives already loaded, already carrying everything it needs to carry, preceded by its own mythology, the way a storm is preceded by a change in the pressure of the air. Blackbeard, the most famous pirate who ever lived. The name that has become, more than any other single word, synonymous with the entire concept of piracy in the Western imagination. The face, or rather, the beard, that appears on more merchandise, more children's costumes, more pub signs and tattoos and illustrated histories than any other figure from the Golden Age. A man so thoroughly embedded in the mythology of what a pirate is and was, and looked like, that to say the word pirate to almost anyone, anywhere, and ask them to produce a mental image is to summon some version of him. The black beard, grown long and wild and braided with ribbons, the broad hat, the bandoliers crossing his chest, heavy with pistols. 6 of them, the accounts say, sometimes more, loaded and ready, worn like a declaration. The enormous frame moving across a deck in battle with the kind of kinetic fury that made experienced sailors decide very quickly that they would rather be somewhere else. And the smoke. This is the detail that separates Blackbeard from every other pirate in the historical record and plants him so firmly in the territory of myth that it seems impossible it could be true. Before going into battle, Edward Teach, his actual name, though the spelling varies across documents, Thatch appearing in some accounts, would weave slow-burning fuses into his beard and light them. Slow match, the sailors called it. Cords soaked in saltpeter and lime water that burned at a controlled, steady rate, used to ignite cannon fire, and now woven into a man's facial hair, and set alight so that he entered combat wreathed in smoke and flame, his face emerging from it like something that had climbed out of the imagery of a nightmare specifically calibrated to unmake the courage of anyone looking at it. The accounts of men who saw him like this, in combat, lit up, smoke curling around his face, his eyes described as dark and burning from within the haze, describe the experience with a consistency that speaks to genuine shared trauma. They used the word devil. They used the word demon. They reached for the language of the supernatural because the natural language available to them was not adequate to describe what their eyes were reporting to their brains. This is where Hollywood, to its credit, has actually gotten something approximately right. The visual spectacle of Blackbeard, the theater of his appearance, the deliberate, orchestrated terror of how he presented himself in the moments that mattered most. That part of the mythology is real. He looked like that. He did that. The smoldering fuses are documented in contemporaneous sources, not invented by later storytellers who needed the image to be more dramatic. But here is the fact that Hollywood has never quite reckoned with, the fact that sits beneath all that spectacular imagery and reframes it completely. Edward Teach, in his entire career as a pirate, almost certainly never killed a single person in cold blood. There is no documented, verified account of Blackbeard murdering a prisoner, no confirmed record of him ordering the execution of a captured crew. In the court records of the era, in the testimony of survivors who encountered him and lived to describe the experience to authorities, in the depositions of merchants whose ships he took and who sat before magistrates and told them exactly what had happened. Across all of that material, which is more extensive than you might expect given his brief career, the violence attributed to Blackbeard is almost entirely the violence of battle, of armed encounter, of men in opposition with weapons in their hands. The casual, deliberate cruelty that his reputation implies, the torture of prisoners, the murder of those who cooperated, the wanton destruction that goes beyond the business logic of piracy into something darker and more purely sadistic. That version of Blackbeard exists primarily in the mythology. The historical Blackbeard was something considerably more interesting. He was a psychological operator of genius-level ability, running a roughly 2-year campaign of managed terror that was extraordinary in its sophistication and ruthless in its calculation. He had understood something about fear that most of his contemporaries had not fully grasped, that a reputation for extreme violence is, in operational terms, more valuable than actual extreme violence, and has the significant additional advantage of not costing you anything. Actual violence costs you, as we established in our discussion of the flag system. It costs you crew, cargo, time, and the operational integrity of your prize. But the reputation for violence, the widespread, firmly held, seafarer to seafarer, transmitted belief that Blackbeard was something beyond a normal man, something beyond a normal danger, something that should be avoided with the kind of urgency you'd apply to a natural disaster rather than a human adversary. That reputation cost him almost nothing to maintain and paid dividends on every ship he approached. When merchant sailors saw that flag and that beard on the horizon, they did not think, "Here comes a man who will give us a fair chance to defend ourselves." They thought, "Here comes the devil himself, and fighting him is not something human beings survive." That thought, arising spontaneously in the minds of the people he was approaching, was worth more than any number of actual battles. It was worth more than any amount of genuine violence. It allowed him to take ships without firing, to demand cooperation and receive it, to operate in waters where naval authority was theoretically present without drawing the kind of sustained, organized response that his actual threat level might have warranted. He was, in the language of a later century, doing psychological operations, and he was extraordinarily good at it. The episode that illustrates this most perfectly is the blockade of Charleston in May of 1718, and it deserves to be better known than it is because it is one of the most audacious, most perfectly executed, and in certain respects most darkly comic events in the entire history of Atlantic piracy. Blackbeard brought a small fleet of vessels, 4 ships, including his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, to the entrance of Charleston Harbor in South Carolina and simply stopped the traffic, not the city, not the harbor itself. He stopped the ships going in and out, taking them as they passed, accumulating prisoners from among the passengers and crew. One of the ships he stopped carried members of the colonial government, a hostage situation that had an immediate and galvanizing effect on the authorities in Charleston, who suddenly found themselves conducting urgent negotiations with the blockade outside their harbor. His demand, the ransom he named for the return of the hostages, and the removal of his fleet from the entrance of one of the most important ports in colonial America, was medicine. A medicine chest, specifically a chest of medical supplies for his crew, who were reportedly suffering from syphilis and other ailments common to men who spend extended periods at sea without adequate access to medical care. He held a city hostage for a medicine chest, and he got it. The chest arrived. The hostages were released, stripped of their valuables, humiliated but alive. And Blackbeard sailed away from Charleston with his medical supplies and the story that would circulate through every port on the American seaboard within weeks, embellishing itself as it traveled, becoming something larger and stranger and more terrifying with each retelling. This is the strategic mind behind the smoke and the braided beard. Not a man in love with violence for its own sake. A man in love with leverage, with the management of perception, with the art of making people believe that the cost of resistance was so catastrophically high that the question was not worth entertaining. He was educated, almost certainly. The letter he wrote to his Charleston hostage demanding the medicine chest was coherent, organized, and precise. The navigation of the complex political geography of the Carolina coast, the relationships with corrupt governors, the management of a fleet, the timing of operations. All of it speaks to a level of intelligence and planning that the Hollywood version of Blackbeard, who is primarily a force of nature rather than a thinking strategist, does not adequately represent. He was killed in November of 1718, barely 2 years into his career as an independent pirate captain, by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy in the shallow waters of Ocracoke Inlet off the coast of North Carolina. The encounter was ambush rather than open battle. Maynard had concealed most of his crew below decks to make his vessel appear undermanned, luring Blackbeard's crew aboard before they surged up from below in numbers the pirates had not accounted for. Even then, the accounts of the fight describe Blackbeard absorbing damage that should have ended him. 5 gunshot wounds, 20 sword cuts by some accounts, before he finally went down. The body was decapitated. Maynard hung Blackbeard's head from his bowsprit and sailed back to port. It was, in its own grim way, an acknowledgement of what Blackbeard had understood about reputation. Even dead, even reduced to a head on a pole, he warranted a symbolic demonstration. The authorities felt the need to prove, visibly and specifically, that the thing they had killed was killable, that it had been a man after all, not the demon the smoke and the beard had suggested, that the image could be unmade by the production of a head. They were not entirely successful. 300 years later, the image is still intact, which tells you something about the quality of the work. Hollywood gives you Blackbeard the monster. The historical record gives you something rarer and in certain ways more unsettling. Blackbeard the architect, a man who looked at the raw materials of human fear and built from them the most durable personal brand in the history of maritime crime. He barely had to hurt anyone. That was, from start to finish, entirely the point. FAC 5, the most dangerous pirates Hollywood ignores, were women. Here is a scene that actually happened. October 1720. A small sloop chartered by the governor of Jamaica moves through the dark water off the northern coast of that island, running without lights, bearing down on another vessel anchored in a quiet cove. The vessel at anchor belongs to a pirate crew operating under a captain known as Calico Jack, John Rackham, named for the brightly colored calico clothing he favored, a man of modest reputation and considerable charm, who had earned his command less through military genius than through a combination of audacity and the particular social intelligence required to keep a crew together on the wrong side of the law. The sloop comes alongside, the naval officers and their men board, and what they find on deck, in the first moments of what was supposed to be a capture operation, is not the pirate crew they were expecting. Most of Calico Jack's crew is below decks, incapacitated by rum in the way that men who have been drinking since afternoon tend to be incapacitated by midnight. They are, in the plainest possible terms, too drunk to fight. 2 people on that deck are not drunk. 2 people meet the boarding party with weapons drawn and every intention of using them. 2 people hold the attacking force at bay long enough to scream down into the hold for their crewmates to come up and fight, and receive back from the darkness below nothing useful. Some shouting, some cursing, the sounds of men who are present but not available. 2 people fight. Both of them are women. Their names are Anne Bonny and Mary Read, and they are 2 of the most genuinely extraordinary individuals in the entire history of the golden age of piracy, which is, given the competition, a considerable thing to say. Hollywood has occasionally gestured in their direction, a supporting character here, a brief appearance there, a fleeting acknowledgement that yes, women existed in this world, and sometimes did remarkable things in it, but the full documented, historically verified story of who these 2 women were, and what they actually did, has never received the treatment it deserves from the cinema that has spent a century building elaborate fantasy structures around far less interesting men. Let us give it that treatment now. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland, the illegitimate daughter of a Cork lawyer named William Cormac and his servant woman. The circumstances of her birth were sufficiently scandalous that her father eventually relocated his small, unconventional family to the Carolinas, where anonymity was more available and the social consequences of irregular domestic arrangements were somewhat less immediately devastating. She grew up in Charlestown, modern Charleston, in a household that had modest prosperity and considerable social complexity, and by every account she grew into a young woman of strong will, sharp temper, and a capacity for decisive action that repeatedly outpaced the patience of the people around her. She married young and badly, in the specific way that strong-willed young women in the early 18th century sometimes married, quickly, in defiance of her father's wishes, to a man who turned out to be considerably less interesting than the idea of defying her father had been. His name was James Bonney, a small-time sailor of no particular distinction, and the marriage appears to have disappointed Anne Bonney almost immediately. When she encountered John Rackham in the social world of Nassau, the Bahamian port city that was at that period the closest thing the Golden Age pirates had to a home base, she left her husband for him without excessive deliberation. She also, shortly thereafter, left the shore entirely. The accounts of Anne Bonney's time aboard Calico Jack's vessel describe her as a fully participating crew member, not a passenger or a captain's companion in the decorative sense. She worked, she fought. She was, by the testimony of people who encountered the crew and survived to describe them to the authorities, indistinguishable in her behavior from the male sailors around her, which was, in the operational context of a pirate vessel, both a practical necessity and, on the evidence of what happened in that cove in October 1720, an accurate description of her actual capabilities. But Anne Bonney's story, remarkable as it is, becomes something stranger and more layered when placed alongside the story of Mary Read, because Mary Read had been doing something that Anne Bonney only adopted as a shipboard practicality for considerably longer and under considerably more complex circumstances. Mary Read had been living as a man, on and off, for most of her life. The particulars of her early biography come primarily from Charles Johnson's General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, a source that is invaluable and frustrating in roughly equal measure. Invaluable because it contains detailed accounts of Golden Age pirates that survive nowhere else. Frustrating because Johnson was not above embellishment, and the line between documented fact and compelling narrative is not always clearly drawn in his pages. With that caveat clearly stated, the broad outlines of what he reports about Mary Read's early life have a specificity that feels like something grounded in actual testimony. Her mother, widowed and in financial difficulty, had a problem. The family's support, from the grandmother of a legitimate child, was contingent on that child being alive and being a boy. The legitimate boy was dead. Mary was alive and was a girl. Her mother dressed her as her dead brother, presented her as him, and continued receiving support from a grandmother who never knew the child she was providing for was not the child she believed her to be. This is where Mary Read's story begins. Not with a choice, not with a declaration, not with any of the conscious, deliberate acts of self-definition that later centuries might recognize as the architecture of an identity. It begins with a mother's pragmatic solution to an economic problem. A child growing up in a costume that became, through sheer duration and repetition, something more than a costume. She fought as a soldier. The accounts place her in Flanders in the long wars of the early 18th century, serving in the infantry and then the cavalry in male dress, distinguished by nothing that marked her as different from the men around her. She married a Flemish soldier, a man who presumably knew who he was marrying, and whose death shortly after ended an apparently happy arrangement. She resumed male dress. She found herself, through a chain of circumstances that Johnson describes, but that resist confident verification, at this distance, aboard a vessel that was taken by pirates. And she stayed. What is documented with considerably more reliability is what happened at the end. The trial of Calico Jack's crew, held in Spanish Town, Jamaica, in November 1720, is preserved in court records that are specific and detailed, and that contain testimony from witnesses who were not pirates and had no reason to embellish in the direction of making the accused seem more formidable than they were. Those witnesses described the scene on deck when the naval sloop boarded. They described the two women fighting. They described the male crew below decks in conditions that the legal language of the period renders with a certain prim disapproval, intoxicated to a degree that rendered them ineffective for the purposes of their own defense. One witness testified that Anne Bonny and Mary Read had cursed the men below and called them cowards, called them in terms that the court record renders with some delicacy, something substantially more forceful than cowards, demanded that they come up and fight, and received from below the sound of men who had made their decision about the evening and were not revising it. The women were captured along with the rest. They were tried. The male crew members, including Calico Jack, were convicted and executed. When Rackham was brought to see Anne Bonny before his hanging, a gesture extended to him apparently as a species of condemned man's courtesy, she told him, according to the accounts that have survived, that she was sorry to see him there, but that if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog. It was, under the circumstances, a precise and devastating thing to say. It was also, given what the trial record establishes about who was fighting on that deck and who was not, entirely accurate. Both women pleaded pregnancy at their trials. Legally speaking, they pleaded their belly, a recognized defense in English law that prevented the immediate execution of a pregnant woman on the grounds that the child she carried was innocent of her crimes. Both were examined. Both were found to be genuinely pregnant. Both were spared immediate execution. Mary Read died in prison in 1721. The records suggest fever, likely connected to the rigors of pregnancy in an 18th century Jamaican jail, which were not the rigors of a well-supported medical experience. She was somewhere in her mid-30s, by best estimation. Anne Bonny disappeared from the historical record. The court records show her alive after her trial, her execution deferred. What happened to her after that? Whether her father's wealth and social connections eventually secured her release, whether she lived out a quiet life under another name somewhere, whether she died in that jail without anyone recording the fact in a way that survived, is genuinely unknown. She simply stops appearing in the documents, which is its own kind of ending, and its own kind of mystery. Hollywood has given us pirates in extravagant, loving, detailed abundance. It has given us their ships and their flags and their weapons and their codes and their curses and their treasure maps and their magnificent, impractical hats. It has given us, in the character of the pirate captain specifically, one of cinema's most durable and beloved archetypes. It has given us almost nothing of Anne Bonny and Mary Read. Not really, not the full story. Not the genuine, documented, court record verified truth of two women who were on that deck in October 1720, doing the thing that the men below them were too drunk and too afraid to do. The most compelling untold story in the history of Golden Age piracy is not about a man at all. It never was. It was two women on a dark deck with weapons in their hands, screaming into a hold full of cowards while the Navy boarded. That story deserves its film. It is still waiting. Fact 6. Pirates almost never buried their treasure. There is a map. There is always a map, drawn on aged parchment, or animal skin, or some material that the passage of time and the drama of the narrative has rendered appropriately fragile and significant, marked with coastlines, with landmarks, with the careful notation of compass bearings and distances paced out in some long-ago moment of secrecy. And somewhere on that map, at the convergence of all those bearings and distances and carefully preserved directions, there is a mark. X. The X that marks the spot where the treasure is buried. The chest driven into the earth at some remote and carefully chosen location. A deserted island. A lonely beach. A cave accessible only at low tide. and covered over and left there, waiting for whoever held the map and could follow its directions to their conclusion. The treasure that exists in the present tense somewhere, intact and waiting, because the man who buried it was captured or killed before he could return for it, and his secret died with him except for this one document that has now found its way into the hands of our protagonists, setting the entire plot in motion. This image is so fundamental to the pirate narrative that to remove it would be to collapse the architecture of half the pirate stories ever told. The treasure map is not merely a plot device, it is the engine. It is the reason the adventure exists, the thing that makes the journey necessary, the reward that waits at the end of all the danger, and the sailing and the navigating of treacherous human relationships on treacherous seas. Without the buried treasure and the map that leads to it, Treasure Island is not a novel. Without the buried treasure and the map that leads to it, an enormous percentage of Hollywood's pirate output simply ceases to have a narrative reason to exist. The buried treasure is, in this sense, load-bearing mythology. It is also, as a representation of what actual Golden Age pirates actually did with their actual money, almost entirely fictional. Real pirates did not bury their treasure, not as a general practice, not as a standard operating procedure, not as the default behavior of men who had successfully taken a prize and needed to do something sensible with the proceeds. The historical record, examined carefully and without the overlay of what 3 centuries of storytelling have told us to expect to find there, shows something considerably different from caves of gold and parchment maps and X's on remote beaches. What it shows is that real pirates, when they got their hands on money, spent it. Immediately, comprehensively, with an enthusiasm and a thoroughness that left them, more often than not, as broke at the end of a port visit as they had been before the voyage that produced the prize. The economics of piracy, understood from the inside, made rapid and total expenditure not merely understandable, but genuinely rational. These were men who lived under a sentence of death that could be executed at any time by any naval vessel or colonial authority but caught them in the wrong waters. They had no access to legitimate banking. They could not invest. They could not build gradually toward a comfortable retirement, because comfortable retirement was not an option the world was offering them. The future was unreliable in ways that made planning for it a practice that consumed energy better spent elsewhere. The present, on the other hand, was right there, and in the port cities that served as the social and commercial centers of the Golden Age pirate world, the present offered quite a lot. Port Royal, Jamaica. If you want to understand where the treasure went, you need to understand Port Royal, because Port Royal in the late 17th century was one of the most extraordinary urban environments on Earth, a place so specific in its character and so vivid in the accounts of those who visited it that even the adjectives used to describe it have a kind of desperate inadequacy, as though language itself is straining to do justice to what it was actually like to walk those streets with a pocket full of recently acquired pieces of eight and no particular obligation to be anywhere else. It was called the richest and the wickedest city in the world, and both halves of that description were accurate and connected. Port Royal sat at the tip of a long spit of land at the entrance to Kingston Harbour, a natural deep-water anchorage that made it the most important trading port in the Caribbean, the hub through which an enormous percentage of the region's commerce flowed. It was also, for a period of roughly 30 years before an earthquake dropped 2/3 of it into the harbour in 692, a city whose relationship with conventional morality was essentially that of a business arrangement that had broken down entirely. Contemporary accounts describe Port Royal as having one drinking establishment for every 10 residents. The number sounds impossible until you consider who the residents were and what they were doing there. Privateers, pirates operating under the legal cover of government commissions that were issued and revoked with a flexibility that made the distinction between privateer and pirate, primarily administrative, used it as their base. Merchants of various ethical profiles used it to buy and sell the goods those privateers brought in. Sailors of every nationality and background cycled through it with the regularity of a tide, and the infrastructure of human pleasure and human vice had developed to serve all of them with a comprehensiveness that made visitors from more restrained corners of the world reach for their journals and write things down. The money moved through Port Royal like water through a sieve. A sailor who arrived with the proceeds of a successful voyage could find, within the geography of that small and densely packed peninsula, every possible way of converting wealth into immediate experience. Taverns that stayed open through the night and catered to men who had no particular interest in sleeping when there were other things available. Gambling of every variety, conducted with the focused intensity of people for whom money is not a thing to be accumulated, but a token to be wagered against the next moment's possibility. Food and drink in quantities that reflected the specific appetite of men who had been eating ship's biscuit and salt pork for months and wanted to remember what the alternative felt like. Clothing, because pirates, it should be noted, had a frequently documented passion for fine dress that sits interestingly alongside every other aspect of their self-presentation. Silk, embroidery, gold braid. The visible, wearable declaration that the man inside these clothes had resources and intended to demonstrate that fact through his wardrobe. Calico Jack, the captain we met in our last story, was named for his clothing preferences. This was not an accident. He was not unusual. The treasure was real. The ships were genuinely taken. The cargo was genuinely seized. The pieces of eight and the silks and the trade goods and the valuables of the passengers were genuinely redistributed according to the articles. The money existed. It simply moved, in most cases, from the prize vessel to the crew to the taverns and gaming houses and merchants and pleasure providers of whatever port they reached next, in a transaction that was completed with a speed and a totality that left very little for any hypothetical map to point toward. Which brings us to the man who was the exception, the single most famous pirate in the history of buried treasure, the figure whose story gave Robert Louis Stevenson enough raw material to construct the myth that has governed the imagination of every subsequent generation. Captain William Kidd. Kidd is a figure of almost painful historical complexity. A man who began his career as a legitimate privateer commissioned by some of the most powerful men in England, whose descent into actual piracy was by his own account largely accidental and by the account of his prosecutors entirely deliberate, who was tried and executed in 1701 in a proceeding that many historians have since characterized as a significant miscarriage of justice, and who has left behind him a legend inflated far beyond the dimensions of his actual career by one specific thing he did before his capture. He buried treasure. Actually, genuinely, documented in sources that are not contested, buried treasure. On Gardiner's Island, off the eastern tip of Long Island, in the summer of 1699, William Kidd deposited a cache of gold, silver, jewels, and other valuables with the owner of the island, John Gardiner, as a kind of insurance policy. He was sailing toward Boston, toward negotiations with the authorities, toward a reckoning he could see coming and was not certain he could survive. The buried treasure. And it was genuinely buried, genuinely on an island, genuinely at a specific location that Gardiner knew and later disclosed, was Kidd's bargaining chip, his evidence of good faith, his demonstration that he had something to offer that made keeping him alive more valuable than hanging him. It did not work. The treasure was recovered by the colonial authorities before Kidd could deploy it as leverage. He was shipped to England, tried, and hanged. His body was displayed in a gibbet over the Thames for 3 years, as a warning to others who might be considering the profession. But the image remained: an island, a buried chest, a man who had hidden his wealth against the possibility of a future he never reached. Robert Louis Stevenson, writing a century and a half later, took that image and built from it the mythology of the treasure map, the X, the deserted island, the adventure organized around the recovery of what someone else had hidden and died before reclaiming. It is one of the most consequential acts of literary construction in the history of the English language. Treasure Island, published in 1883, gave us the pirate adventure as a genre. It gave us Long John Silver, who gave us the pirate character as a type. It gave us the treasure map as a narrative engine. And it gave us, most persistently, the image of buried pirate treasure as a standard feature of the pirate world. A thing that was simply done, simply expected, simply part of how pirates operated. From one man's desperate, failed attempt to use his stolen goods as a legal bargaining chip, Stevenson constructed a mythology that has not loosened its grip in 140 years. The real pirates spent their money in the first port they reached and were broke by Tuesday. The map was never real. The X was never there, but we have been looking for it ever since, which is its own kind of testament to the power of a story told well enough, at the right moment, to the right audience. And in that sense, in the specific sense of a fiction so well constructed that it became more real than the reality it replaced, Stevenson did something the pirates themselves would have recognized and possibly admired. He took something ordinary and made it legendary. That, after all, was always the business they were in. FACT 7. Every pirate accent you've ever heard was invented by one man in 1950. Close your eyes one more time. We did this at the beginning, and it served us well, so we're doing it again. Close your eyes, and this time don't picture the image of a pirate. Listen for the sound of one, not the cannons, not the creak of rigging, not the wind or the water or the percussion of a cutlass meeting something it shouldn't. Listen for the voice. It's there immediately, isn't it? You don't have to search for it or construct it. It simply arrives, fully formed, the way all the most deeply embedded cultural information arrives. Not retrieved, but present, already waiting when you reach for it. The rolling, exaggerated, heavily inflected sound of it. The way certain vowels stretch and curl. The specific texture of the consonants. The way the letter R behaves, taking up more space than it strictly needs, insisting on itself with a persistence that borders on theatrical. And the word. The specific, singular, utterly iconic sound that above all other sounds in the English language signals pirate, that has been used in films and television and comedy sketches and children's costumes and novelty merchandise and an entire dedicated annual holiday to communicate one thing and one thing only with a speed and efficiency that no other combination of sounds in any language can quite match. Ah, you heard it. You heard it before I finished writing it. It was already there. Now here is the fact that will, if you let it fully land, change the way you hear that sound for the rest of your life. Every pirate accent you have ever heard, in every film, every television series, every novel read aloud, every Halloween costume brought to life by an enthusiastic child or a less than enthusiastic adult at an office party. Every single version of that sound, that rolling, rum-soaked, dramatically over-voweled voice that the entire world now recognizes as the sound of piracy, traces back in a direct and unbroken line to a single performance by a single actor in a single film released in a single year. The year was 1950. The film was Treasure Island. The actor was a British man named Robert Newton, who was born in Shaftesbury in Dorset in 1905, grew up in the West Country of England, trained as a stage actor, developed a reputation in the British film industry of the 1930s and 40s as a performer of considerable intensity and, it was noted by colleagues with the particular diplomatic phrasing that the British deploy when they mean something less flattering, considerable enthusiasm for alcohol. Considerable enthusiasm for alcohol. Robert Newton played Long John Silver in the 1950 Disney adaptation of Robert Louis Stevenson's novel, and in doing so he did something that no actor before him had done, and that no actor since has been able to undo. He invented the way pirates sound, not refined it, not built on an existing tradition. Invented it from whole cloth, drawing primarily on the regional accent of his own West Country upbringing, a dialect already characterized by a strongly rhotic R, a rolling quality to certain vowels, a musicality in the rhythm of speech that sits somewhere between the measured pace of standard received English and something older and more maritime in its cadences, and amplifying it, stretching it, pushing it past the boundaries of naturalism into something that was larger than a real accent, more theatrical than a real accent, more immediately and universally legible as a signal than any real accent could be. The result was Long John Silver as you know him, or as your parents know him, or as the cultural DNA of every pirate story you have ever encountered knows him. The rolling gait, the crutch, the parrot, and that voice. That specific, unmistakable, world-altering voice. Before Robert Newton sat in front of a camera and opened his mouth in that particular way, there was no standard pirate accent. There was no sound that the world associated with pirates the way it now associates that sound. Earlier pirate films had given their characters whatever accent the actor happened to possess, or whatever the director thought sounded suitably roguish and maritime. There was no template. There was no established convention. The cinematic pirate was visually established by the early 20th century. The hat, the coat, the sword, all of it broadly in place. But acoustically, orally, in the specific register of how pirates sounded when they spoke, the space was open. Robert Newton filled it in the space of one film and then returned to fill it further. He reprised the role of Long John Silver in a 1954 theatrical sequel, and then in a 1955 television series, the first Australian television series ever produced. Each appearance reinforcing the connection, deepening the groove in the cultural record, making the voice more and more the voice, until by the time the 1950s ended, the equation was complete and permanent. Long John Silver sounded like that. Therefore pirates sounded like that. Therefore every pirate, in every story, in every medium, in every corner of the world that consumed English language entertainment, and that corner was very large and growing, sounded like that. Within a single generation, the accent was universal. There is something almost vertiginous about this, if you let yourself sit with it. The golden age of piracy ended in the 1730s. The men and women who lived it were dead before 1750, and for 200 years after that, their voices, the actual sounds they made when they spoke, the genuine acoustic texture of the communities they formed, and the orders they gave, and the arguments they had, and the songs they sang in those taverns where the treasure went, those real sounds floated in the historical record, unheard, unrecoverable, belonging only to the people who had been there and were long gone. And then one actor from Dorset made one film, and overnight the world decided it knew exactly what pirates sounded like. What did the real pirates actually sound like? The honest answer is, like wherever they came from, which was everywhere. Anne Bonny was Irish, born in Cork, raised in the Carolinas. Her voice would have carried traces of both, some combination of Irish cadence and American colonial inflection that belonged to neither of those places entirely, and to both of them simultaneously. The way accents form in people who move between worlds before they are fully formed. Bartholomew Roberts, Black Bart, the most successful pirate of the entire Golden Age, was Welsh. Born in Pembrokeshire, in the far west of Wales, in a community where Welsh was the primary language and English was a second tongue. He would have sounded Welsh, not pirate. Welsh. Blackbeard, Edward Teach, was likely from Bristol, which is, it must be acknowledged, in the West Country of England, which makes him the one major pirate figure whose actual regional origins might have produced something in the vicinity of what Robert Newton later invented. But Bristol English in the early 18th century was not the exaggerated, theatrical, ara-saturated performance that Newton gave the world. It was a regional British accent, specific and local, and unremarkable to the people who spoke it. No more inherently piratical than any other way of arranging the sounds of English. The crews themselves were a cacophony. We established in our second fact that pirate crews were drawn from across the Atlantic world and beyond. English, Irish, Welsh, Scottish, American colonial, West African, Afro-Caribbean, French, Dutch, Spanish, Portuguese, Malagasy, South Asian. These people did not share a language, let alone an accent. They communicated across those barriers in maritime pidgin, in fragments of multiple languages, in the specific technical vocabulary of sailing that crosses linguistic lines because the sea requires common terms for common things regardless of where you came from. They would have sounded, to modern ears, like the most extraordinary and disorienting mixture of voices imaginable. A community of sound that reflected the radical diversity of the community itself. None of them would have sounded like Robert Newton. And yet, Robert Newton is what we hear. Every time, in every medium, in every language that has dubbed or subtitled or adapted English language pirate content for its own audience, the convention has traveled intact, translated, localized, adapted to the phonetic possibilities of the target language, but always building in that same rolling, exaggerated, unmistakably theatrical quality that Newton established as the baseline. Japanese pirates in anime sound like the Japanese equivalent of Robert Newton. Spanish-dubbed pirate films give their characters the Spanish equivalent of that specific timbre. The accent has become a concept rather than a sound, a set of instructions for how to signal piracy through voice rather than a specific collection of phonemes. And those instructions are followed, consistently and globally, by people who may never have heard of Robert Newton and have certainly never sat down to consciously trace the lineage of the voice they are producing. There is, in a further twist that contains its own dark comedy, a holiday. International Talk Like a Pirate Day falls on September 19th of every year, a date that was established in 1995 by two Americans named John Bohr and Mark Summers, who invented it, by their own account, during a recreational racquetball game, and which gained its global profile when the humorist Dave Barry wrote about it in 2002, and the internet did what the internet does with things it finds delightful. Millions of people around the world now observe this holiday in offices and schools and on social media by producing their best approximation of the Newton accent and deploying the Newton vocabulary. The aras, the avasts, the shiver-me timbers, the ahoys, in honor of a historical community that spoke nothing like any of it and would not have recognized a single element of the performance. The pirates of the Golden Age have a holiday. Their holiday celebrates a voice they never used, invented by an actor who died in 1956, derived from a novel published in 1883 by a Scottish author who had never met a pirate and was primarily interested in writing an adventure story for his stepson. This is how mythology works, in the end. This is the mechanism by which the distance between history and legend gets covered mile by mile, until the two things are so far apart that the journey between them requires exactly this kind of documentary effort to map. A man from Dorset opened his mouth in 1950, and the world heard the past speak. It still hasn't stopped listening. We have covered 7 facts today, 7 places where the historical record and the Hollywood record diverge so completely that they might as well be describing different worlds. But there are others. There are always others. We did not have time to tell you that walking the plank, perhaps the single most iconic image of pirate punishment in the popular imagination, the thing that every child who has ever played pirates has threatened every other child who has ever played pirates with, is almost certainly fiction, pure, invented, narratively convenient fiction. The historical record contains no reliable, verified account of any pirate crew forcing a prisoner to walk off a plank into open water. It appears, like so much else in the pirate mythology, to have been invented by the literature of the 19th century, which needed dramatic mechanisms for disposing of characters and found the plank irresistible. What pirates actually did with prisoners was considerably more varied and considerably less cinematic. Many were released at the next port, many were offered the choice to join the crew. Skilled workers like surgeons and carpenters were kept aboard and compensated under the articles, and the ones who got truly bad treatment were, more often than not, the ones who had been cruel to their own men before the pirates arrived. We did not have time to tell you that the ships were wrong. The great, towering, cannon-bristling galleons of the movie screen, those magnificent floating fortresses that look so extraordinary against a painted sunset, were not what most pirates actually sailed. They were too slow, too expensive to maintain, too difficult to crew, too visible, and too hard to get into shallow harbors where the naval vessels hunting you could not follow. Real pirates preferred smaller, faster vessels, sloops, brigantines, ships that could run when they needed to run and catch when they needed to catch, nimble enough to work the coastlines and the shallows and the intricate geography of the Caribbean islands with a kind of flexibility that a ship of the line simply could not offer. The ships of the Golden Age were built for speed and practicality, not for the grandeur that makes such extraordinary cinema. We did not have time to tell you that the real treasure was almost never gold. It was cloth. It was food. It was rope and timber and naval stores and the mundane, unglamorous cargo of the actual 18th century trade economy. The material that kept civilization running and that pirates seized because it had value and could be sold, not because it made a satisfying pile at the bottom of a chest. The golden doubloons and the ropes of pearls and the jewels spilling from overflowing coffers. That existed, occasionally, in the specific context of particularly rich prizes. But the daily bread of the pirate economy was considerably more prosaic than the movies have ever found it worthwhile to depict. We did not have time to tell you about Nassau, about the extraordinary, chaotic, genuinely unprecedented experiment in self-governance that a loose community of pirates and outcasts and escaped slaves and political refugees conducted on the island of New Providence in the Bahamas in the early 18th century, a period sometimes called the Pirate Republic, a name that is slightly more organized sounding than the reality warranted, but that captures something essential about what was being attempted, a community beyond the reach of any king, governed by its own rough consensus, operating by its own rules, lasting until Woodes Rogers arrived as the new royal governor in 1718, with a pardon in one hand and a noose in the other, and the political intelligence to understand that you could end a pirate republic more efficiently by offering its members a legal future than by trying to kill them all. We did not have time for all of it. We never have time for all of it. History is always larger than the containers we build to hold it, always spilling past the edges of our 7 facts and our 90 minutes and our best efforts to do justice to what actually happened. But here is what we do have time for, and what this documentary would be incomplete without saying clearly and without reservation. Hollywood got the facts wrong. Hollywood got the details wrong. Hollywood invented an accent and buried treasure that wasn't there, and put the wrong ships on the wrong seas and gave the captains a tyranny they didn't possess, and stripped the crews of a diversity they absolutely had. Hollywood took a complex, morally ambiguous, genuinely revolutionary moment in human history and simplified it into something cleaner and more dramatic and considerably less true. And in doing so, Hollywood gave the world something that the historical record, for all its richness, could not have given on its own. It gave us the feeling of it, the feeling of standing on the deck of a ship with the wind behind you and the horizon ahead, and no authority on earth, telling you where to point your bow. The feeling of a world where the rules were made by the people who lived under them, where the sea was genuinely free in ways that the land had not yet figured out how to be, where an ordinary person from an ordinary life could step outside the systems that had defined them and become something that the systems had no category for. The feeling of choosing fire over comfort, speed over safety, the short, bright road over the long, quiet one. That feeling is real. It is historically grounded, even when the specific images carrying it are not. The pirates of the Golden Age were genuinely, demonstrably doing something radical with their brief and dangerous lives. Something that the myths, for all their inaccuracy, have always somehow managed to transmit even through the distortions. The cinema has been telling this story for over a century. From the earliest silent swashbucklers to the elaborate, effects-driven spectacles of our own era, it has returned to these waters again and again, drawn back by something it cannot quite name, but cannot stop reaching for. The stories keep coming because something in the pirate myth speaks to something permanent in the human imagination. The desire to be free, to be brave, to be part of a community built on chosen loyalty rather than inherited obligation, to live with total commitment to whatever it is you have decided your life is for. The facts we have shared today are not meant to diminish any of that. They are meant to deepen it, because the real story, the democratic articles, the diverse crews, the psychological genius of the flag system, the calculated brilliance of Blackbeard's manufactured terror, the women who were fighting when the men were below decks, the money spent in one glorious evening rather than buried in a chest against a future that might never come. That story is more interesting than the mythology, more human, more complicated, more worth the telling. What we hope, looking forward, is that Hollywood finds its way to it, because there are films waiting to be made about Bartholomew Roberts, the Welsh pirate who captured 500 ships and wrote himself a constitution and flew a flag with his boot on the skulls of the governors who hunted him. There are films waiting to be made about Anne Bonny and Mary Read. A proper film, the full story, the Ireland and the Flanders campaign in the Cove in October, and the courtroom and the cold Jamaican jail, and all the complicated, irreducible truth of two women who chose the sea and paid for it and fought for it and deserve more than a supporting role in someone else's adventure. There are films waiting to be made about the crews themselves, the escaped slaves and the press-ganged sailors, and the Welsh captains and the Irish girls and the surgeons who chose the articles over the navy, and the men who gathered in firelit holds to vote on the course of their own ship. The golden age of piracy lasted less than a century. The stories it generated have lasted 300 years and show no signs of stopping. Hollywood has been the primary custodian of those stories for over 100 years now, and it has discharged that custodianship with more imagination than accuracy, which is perhaps exactly the right way to describe what movies have always done with history. We are grateful for every ship on every painted sea. We are hopeful for what comes next. The black flag is still flying. The best stories are still out there. And the horizon, as it always has been, is wide open.